Have you ever thought, like, what if just singing about your grandma could get you in trouble?
Yeah.
It's crazy, right?
It's a wild thought.
But it's the reality for the Uyghurs.
It is.
This
Yeah.
Muslim minority group in China that's facing such intense scrutiny these days, and that's exactly what we're diving deep into today.
Yeah,
Their story.
absolutely.
And we're not just going to look at the headlines,
Right.
but the whole picture.
The whole tapestry.
Yeah, their culture, the challenges they face.
Yes.
And our guide for this is this amazing NPR episode of Throughline.
They did such a good job.
They really did. They talked to scholars,
Yeah.
journalists, even Uyghurs who've lived through this firsthand.
Really gives you that perspective.
It does.
It's important we start by, really understanding who the Uyghurs are.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people hear Uyghurs and they think, okay, Muslim group, Turkic language.
Right.
But there's so much more to it.
It's like that saying beside.
Yes.
5 fingers aren't the same.
Exactly.
And they really emphasize that they're so diverse. They have their own language traditions.
Right.
A culture that's got these Persian and Turkic influences all woven in.
Beautifully woven in.
Yeah.
And you have to think about their homeland, too, the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region.
Right.
It's been this crossroads of empires, and for centuries.
Centuries.
Think Silk Road, the exchange of ideas, all the different cultures blending. It's all part of who they are.
It's all embedded in their identity.
Yes.
So let's go back in time a bit.
Okay.
The NPR episode talks about this golden age for the Uyghur culture.
Uh-huh.
And it was in the 1980s.
Right after the Cultural Revolution.
Exactly.
The things loosen up a little bit.
Yeah, there was this resurgence of their traditions, their language, their religious practices.
Yeah, they could practice more openly.
And they even had festivals like Mashreb.
I love that one.
Yeah, where they celebrated their heritage.
Through music and poetry and dance.
Amazing.
It's really beautiful.
Imagine that after years of being suppressed culturally.
Right.
And then suddenly there's this, like, burst of expression, this reawakening.
It's such a stark contrast to what we see now.
It really is.
Sad.
Yeah, but then as we know, things shifted.
Yeah.
1989 Tiananmen Square.
Big turning point.
It sent ripples of fear through the Chinese government.
They were worried about losing control.
Yeah, worries about separatism grew.
Uh-huh.
And the Uyghurs, with their distinct identity, well, they became a target.
It makes sense from their perspective, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Like, the collapse of the Soviet Union was happening around the same time.
Right around then.
So the Chinese Communist Party, they saw all these events as threats.
Threats to their power.
Exactly, to their control.
So they started viewing any difference,
Any expression of cultural difference.
particularly from minorities,
Yeah, especially
as like a potential seed of instability.
like it could sprout up and cause trouble.
Yeah, and so even when China was having this huge economic boom,
Right, the 90s and the 2000s.
the Uyghurs, they often felt left behind.
They did?
It's like that image from the 1993 New York Times article.
Chilling image.
There's a Uyghur merchant, and he describes Xinjiang as his palm
Okay.
being crushed by the fist of China.
Wow.
It's powerful.
It is.
It really captures that feeling.
Of marginalization.
Yeah, and it wasn't just a feeling.
No, it was real.
The development projects they didn't really consider the Uyghurs' needs.
Right.
And sometimes they would even destroy historical sites.
Yeah, that were important to their heritage.
So the economic benefits weren't really trickling down to them.
Not in a way that felt fair or equitable.
And then, of course, 9/11 happened.
Right.
And that changed everything.
The whole world shifted.
It did. And it had a direct impact on the Uyghurs.
It did.
Because the war on terror that followed it gave the Chinese government this new narrative.
Yeah, a way to kind of frame this crackdown.
Exactly. They started portraying the Uyghurs as potential terrorists.
Even though there wasn't much evidence.
Yeah, drawing links to groups like Al-Qaeda.
Right, trying to connect them.
And that's when they launched that Three Evils campaign.
Targeting terrorism, extremism, and separatism.
And they even came up with this idea of ideological separatism.
Essentially making it a crime.
Yeah, to express Uyghur identity.
Like their music, their poetry, even teaching their own language was suddenly a threat.
It's like they were trying to control every aspect of their lives.
It was a way to justify more surveillance, more control.
Anything that didn't align with the Han Chinese culture.
It was labeled dangerous.
Imagine what that did to their everyday life.
I mean, the chilling effect is unimaginable.
It's really scary to think about.
And then it all kind of escalated.
Yeah, after the 2009 riots in Urumqi.
Right. Those riots started because of a clash between Uyghur and Han Chinese workers.
They did. It was really just this outburst of tension.
Years and years of resentment
Yeah.
over economic disparities, the cultural restrictions.
It all just boiled over.
And the government's response was immediate.
Yeah. Swift and brutal.
They basically turned Xinjiang into a surveillance state.
It's crazy. The NPR episode talks about checkpoints everywhere, surveillance cameras on every corner.
It must have felt like living in an open-air prison.
Yeah, and that brings us to one of the most disturbing parts of all of this.
The internment camps.
It started around 2017, right?
Yeah, that's when we started hearing reports of these camps.
Where Uyghurs and other minorities were being detained.
It's just horrifying.
The stories from the episode are just heartbreaking. Like, there's this one man who describes being tortured with this device they call an iron coat.
I read about that.
They force his arms into this, like, crucifixion pose.
Hours.
It's awful. And then another survivor talks about the psychological manipulation they used.
Oh, yeah.
They would play recordings of children crying for help.
Trying to break them down mentally.
It's systematic, it's deliberate, it's cruel.
What's even more disturbing is how the Chinese government tries to present these camps.
Yeah.
They give these staged tours to some journalists calling them vocational training centers.
Right. You see pictures of detainees singing and smiling.
But it's all a facade.
The reality is so much darker.
Forced labor political indoctrination. The erasure of Uyghur culture.
It's cultural genocide.
Happening right in front of us.
And it's not just happening in these camps.
It's everywhere.
They're trying to sever family ties, discourage the use of the Uyghur language.
Replacing their traditions with Han Chinese culture.
It's like they want to wipe out their entire identity.
It's heartbreaking.
The NPR episode tells this story of Abduli Ayub.
I know him.
He's a Uyghur poet and activist.
Yeah.
And he was forced into exile.
After his family was targeted because of his work.
For trying to preserve his own culture.
Imagine that your own sister forced to denounce you as a terrorist because you're proud of your heritage.
It's insane.
It shows this isn't just about politics.
This is about people.
Real people's lives being torn apart.
And it's not just an internal Chinese matter either.
No, the episode brings up some tough questions about the global community.
Like, what about Western companies doing business in Xinjiang?
Are they complicit?
There are allegations of forced labor in those supply chains.
It's a huge dilemma.
Morally and economically.
We're so intertwined with China economically.
But can we just ignore these human rights abuses?
It makes you think about our own consumption habits?
Yeah. About the ethics of globalization?
It's complicated.
What about social media?
Yeah.
Are these platforms being used for propaganda and censorship?
To silence Uyghur voices.
It's a valid concern.
Absolutely. The control of information is a powerful tool.
And we need to be aware of how it's being used.
To shape the narrative both inside and outside of China.
It's a complex issue. It's easy to feel overwhelmed.
It is, but the episode reminds us that even small actions can make a difference.
They can.
Awareness is the first step.
Yeah.
Understanding the Uyghurs' history, their culture.
Their traditions.
Recognizing their humanity, their individuality.
So beyond awareness, what can people actually do?
Well, there are organizations doing amazing work. Supporting the Uyghurs, documenting these atrocities, providing legal aid, advocating for their rights.
Supporting those organizations can make a real difference.
Even in small ways.
And what about those of us who aren't activists?
Well, we all have choices.
Right.
We can be more mindful about what we buy,
Yeah.
where things are made, who's making them.
Supporting companies that are transparent and ethical.
Exactly.
So being informed is crucial.
It is.
Where can people go to learn more?
Reputable news sources, human rights organizations, academic journals.
It's important to be discerning, though, right?
Oh, absolutely. Cross-reference your information. Be wary of propaganda from any side.
This is such a daunting challenge.
It is, but it's a conversation we need to have.
Yeah.
The more we talk about it, the more awareness we raise,
Yeah.
the harder it becomes for these abuses to stay hidden.
It's about holding those in power accountable.
In China and globally.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away?
The Uyghurs are facing a cultural and humanitarian crisis, but there is hope the world is watching, and the more we know, the more we speak out, the more we act, the greater the chance for justice and change. It's about recognizing their humanity, their resilience, their right to exist. It's about not letting their stories be erased.
You know, it's tough to hear all this, but it sounds like the episode does offer some hope.
Yeah, a little bit, right?
Like, even with China's tight control, there's been some pushback internationally.
Yeah. It's encouraging to see some countries have imposed sanctions,
Uh-huh.
and the UN's launched investigations. The
Yeah.
media is shining a light on it, even if it's tough to get independent access.
It seems like that pressure from the outside is really important.
Absolutely. Holding China accountable is key. It's not just about the Uyghurs, either.
No.
This sets a precedent for human rights everywhere.
Right. Silence just emboldens those who want to oppress and control.
Exactly.
It's a reminder we can't just stand by and watch.
We can't.
We have to speak out.
Yeah.
Demand justice, support those fighting for their rights.
It's our responsibility.
And it's not just about these big gestures or political statements either.
No, it's about everyday choices.
Right.
Being conscious about what we buy.
Yes, supporting organizations that are helping.
Every little bit counts.
So what does all this mean for our listeners?
Mm-hmm.
What's the one thing they should take away from this whole deep dive?
Well, I think the story of the Uyghurs, it reminds us that even now in our super interconnected world, terrible things can happen.
Yeah.
It's a call to action.
It is.
To be more aware, to educate ourselves.
And to speak up for those whose voices are being silenced.
Right. Our choices have consequences.
They do.
We have to stand up for what's right.
Powerful message. Powerful message. And as we wrap up this conversation, is there any final thought you want to leave our listeners with?
I think the plight of the Uyghurs, it really challenges us to look inward.
Yeah.
How can we as individuals and as a global community create a world where different cultures are celebrated, not criminalized? A world where everyone can express their identity freely and without fear. That's the world we should be working towards. And it starts with awareness, empathy, and action.
That's a great place to end it. I think, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a tough conversation, but an important one. We encourage you to learn more about the Uyghurs and find ways to support their fight for justice. And remember, even small actions can make a difference. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and as always, keep questioning.